14-year-old Nacole Smith lived in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1995. On the morning of June 7, she left home with her sister, and together they walked toward Ralph Bunche Middle School. During the walk, Nacole realized she had forgotten something at home. She decided to turn back alone while her sister continued. To save time, Nacole cut through a wooded area along the route. While passing through the woods, Nacole encountered a man who indecently assaulted her. After the assault, he shot her twice in the face. Nacole never returned home after separating from her sister that morning. Her death marked the beginning of an investigation that would continue for many years before investigators finally identified the person responsible. Investigators carefully processed the crime scene and examined the available physical evidence. During their examination, they recovered male DNA from Nacole's body. Recognizing its potential importance, they preserved the DNA for future forensic testing, even though the available technology and investigative methods at the time could not immediately identify its source. Despite extensive investigative efforts, detectives were unable to develop useful leads that pointed to a suspect. The recovered DNA remained an important piece of evidence, but without a matching profile or additional information, it could not provide investigators with the answers they needed. As the initial investigation continued, Nacole's killer remained unidentified. Although critical forensic evidence had been collected and carefully stored, no immediate breakthrough followed, leaving investigators without a suspect and Nacole's family without answers in the aftermath of the crime. Following Nacole Smith's murder, investigators worked to identify the man responsible. Detectives pursued available leads, examined evidence, and attempted to build a clear investigative path. Male DNA recovered from Nacole's body remained one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence, but the investigative methods available during the mid-1990s could not connect that DNA to a known individual. Without a matching profile or other meaningful evidence pointing toward a suspect, the investigation produced no definitive answers, despite continued efforts. As time passed, months became years without substantial progress. The absence of new evidence or reliable suspect information caused the investigation to lose momentum, and Nacole's case eventually became a cold case. Although the preserved DNA remained important, investigators had no practical way to use it to identify the attacker with the forensic capabilities then available. The case remained open, but meaningful developments were limited. In 2002, Detective Vincent Velasquez reopened Nacole's case, bringing renewed attention to the investigation. He revisited the available evidence and continued searching for information that might identify the person responsible. During the first 2 years after reopening the case, Detective Velasquez worked extensively, reviewing evidence and pursuing investigative avenues in an effort to move the case forward. Despite those sustained efforts, no suspect was identified, and the investigation remained stalled. Even with renewed commitment and continued investigative work, the evidence still failed to reveal the attacker's identity. The preserved DNA remained central to the case, but it could not yet provide the breakthrough investigators needed. Then, in 2004, an incident in a nearby Georgia community unexpectedly created the first significant breakthrough connected to Nacole Smith's case, changing the direction of the investigation forever. In 2004, 13-year-old Betty Brown lived in East Point, Georgia. That year, she was indecently assaulted by an unknown man, but unlike Nacole Smith, Betty survived the attack. The assault occurred only a few miles from the location where Nacole had been murdered years earlier. Because Betty survived, investigators were able to gather additional evidence that had not been available in Nacole's case, creating an important opportunity to revisit the unsolved investigation. Investigators collected DNA evidence from Betty Brown's assault and compared it with the preserved DNA recovered from Nacole Smith's case. The forensic testing revealed that both DNA profiles matched. This discovery confirmed that the same individual was responsible for both crimes. For investigators, the connection represented the first major breakthrough since Nacole's murder, linking two separate cases through scientific evidence rather than witness testimony or circumstantial information. Betty's survival also provided investigators with valuable descriptive information. She described her attacker as an African-American man who appeared to be in his 30s. Using her account, investigators created a composite sketch intended to help identify the suspect.
The sketch was distributed throughout the surrounding area in hopes that someone would recognize the individual and provide information leading to his identification. Despite the DNA match and the publicly shared composite sketch, investigators still could not identify the attacker. No information emerged that was sufficient to establish his identity or lead to an arrest. Even with the strongest evidence developed since Nacole's murder, the investigation remained unsolved. However, the linked DNA evidence and the close proximity of both attacks led investigators to believe that the offender most likely lived in the surrounding area, reinforcing their determination to continue pursuing the case until answers were finally found. Following the confirmed connection between Nacole Smith's case and Betty Brown's assault, Detective Vincent Velasquez continued working to identify the offender. He remained committed to the investigation, revisiting evidence, following potential leads, and maintaining regular communication with Nacole's family throughout the years. He kept them informed about developments while continuing to pursue every available avenue that might identify the person responsible. As the investigation continued, Detective Velasquez conducted hundreds of interviews in an effort to uncover information that could move the case forward. Investigators also collected more than 50 blood samples from individuals considered relevant to the investigation. Each interview and sample represented another attempt to compare evidence and determine whether anyone could be connected to the DNA recovered during the investigation. Despite these extensive efforts, none of the investigative work produced the identification investigators had been seeking. Years passed as Detective Velasquez continued pursuing the case. Although DNA evidence remained central to the investigation, repeated attempts to match it with potential suspects failed to produce an arrest. Even after establishing the connection between Nacole's murder and Betty Brown's assault, the offender's identity remained unknown. Detective Velasquez stayed dedicated to the investigation until his retirement in 2017, refusing to abandon the search for answers despite the lack of a breakthrough. Although Detective Velasquez retired without solving Nacole Smith's case, his years of investigative work preserved the evidence, documented the investigative progress, and maintained momentum for the case. His persistence ensured that future detectives inherited a well-developed investigation, providing a strong foundation for those who would continue searching for answers in the years that followed. After Detective Vincent Velasquez retired in 2017, Detective Scott DeMeester assumed responsibility for Nacole Smith's investigation. He inherited years of preserved evidence and investigative records, along with the DNA findings that had connected Nacole's case to the assault on Betty Brown. Rather than abandoning earlier work, Detective DeMeester continued building upon it, focusing on investigative methods that had become available after the original investigation began. Detective DeMeester applied genealogy and ancestry database techniques to the DNA evidence collected during the investigation. Investigators spent approximately 3 years using these newer forensic methods to narrow their search and identify a person of interest. The process required patience, but it offered investigators a new approach that had not been available during the earlier stages of the case. As the work continued, the preserved DNA evidence remained the central element, guiding the investigation toward a possible identification. During the investigation, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Laboratory successfully matched the DNA profile connected to Betty Brown's assault. Shortly afterward, investigators confirmed that the same individual was responsible for Nacole Smith's murder. The confirmation established that both crimes had been committed by one offender, providing investigators with the evidence needed to officially resolve the long-standing investigation. By 2022, investigators had identified the offender responsible for both crimes, bringing Nacole Smith's case to an official conclusion nearly 3 decades after her death. The breakthrough resulted from the continued preservation of DNA evidence and the application of genealogy techniques that allowed investigators to reach an identification when earlier investigative methods had been unsuccessful. The investigation ultimately demonstrated how advances in forensic technology helped resolve a case that had remained unsolved for many years. Following the press conference, authorities publicly identified the offender as 49-year-old Kelvin Arnold. According to the available background information, little is publicly known about him beyond the fact that he had lived close to both Nacole Smith and Betty Brown.
Publicly known about him beyond the fact that he had lived close to both Nacole Smith and Betty Brown. By the time investigators officially solved the case, Arnold had already died, meaning he would never face prosecution or answer the many questions that remained about the crimes. The identification marked the final chapter in an investigation that had remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. Advances in DNA technology and the use of genealogy ultimately connected the evidence from both cases and allowed investigators to identify the same individual as the offender. Those developments transformed preserved forensic evidence into the key that finally resolved Nacole Smith's murder after years without meaningful progress. Although the investigation reached an official conclusion, Nacole Smith's mother explained that the emotional impact of losing her daughter would never disappear. While the identification answered the central question of who was responsible, she made it clear that the pain caused by Nacole's death would remain with her for the rest of her life. The resolution resulted from the combined efforts of many people over many years. Detective Vincent Velasquez's persistence preserved the investigation through decades of work. Detective Scott DeMeester's use of genealogy techniques helped move the case toward its final resolution. Betty Brown's survival provided investigators with evidence that connected both crimes, and the preserved DNA evidence remained essential throughout the investigation. Together, those factors allowed investigators to identify Kelvin Arnold and officially solve Nacole Smith's case nearly 30 years after her death, bringing the documented investigation to its conclusion. After investigators confirmed the identity of the offender in 2022, the Atlanta Police Department held a press conference to announce that Nacole Smith's case had finally been solved. During the announcement, officials deliberately chose not to publicly identify the offender. Instead, they explained that they wanted the moment to remain focused on the victims, their families, and the detectives, whose dedication over many years had made the resolution possible. The announcement emphasized the investigation rather than the individual responsible. Investigators disclosed only that the offender had died on the 29th of August 2021 while receiving hospice care for liver and kidney failure. Because he had already died before the case was officially resolved, many questions surrounding the crimes would never be answered directly by the person responsible. Nacole Smith's mother addressed the outcome publicly, describing the moment as bittersweet after living without answers for nearly 30 years. She said she had never imagined the offender would already be deceased and explained that she still carried many unanswered questions she would never have the opportunity to ask. Although the investigation had identified the person responsible, she said she could never truly consider the outcome complete closure because the pain of losing Nacole would remain with her for the rest of her life. Betty Brown also spoke publicly after keeping her experience private for many years. She explained that she felt conflicted, wanting to move forward while also wishing the offender could experience the suffering that her family had endured. Betty also expressed gratitude to Nacole's mother and Detective Vincent Velasquez, explaining that both had remained in contact with her throughout the years, regularly checking on her well-being and providing support that she deeply appreciated during her long recovery. Wesley Powell was sitting inside his vehicle at a Wausau gas station in Birmingham, Alabama, when the events that would define this case unfolded. According to the available information, an unknown man approached the vehicle and stood inside the open passenger side door. Moments later, the man shot Wesley several times before leaving the scene. The attack ended quickly, but its consequences continued long afterward for investigators and Powell's family. Following the shooting, Wesley was transported to a hospital for medical treatment. Despite those efforts, he did not survive his injuries. He died the following day, turning the shooting into a homicide investigation. The available information does not describe any interaction between Wesley and the gunman before the shooting, nor does it explain why the attack occurred. Those details remain outside the information provided and cannot be expanded upon within this account. After the shooting, the gunman fled the gas station on foot. Witnesses observed the suspect leaving the scene and were able to provide investigators with a basic description. They reported that the person responsible was a young black male. However, none of the witnesses recognized him or could identify who he was. Beyond that description, investigators had no additional information that immediately identified the suspect. With the gunman gone and no confirmed identity available, investigators were left searching for the person responsible. The information gathered immediately after the shooting established the foundation of the case, but it did not provide an immediate resolution. Wesley Powell's death marked the beginning of a lengthy homicide investigation, one that would continue long after the events at the Birmingham gas station, as authorities worked to determine who carried out the fatal shooting and bring the responsible individual into custody. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, investigators began working to determine who had killed Wesley Powell. Witnesses who had been present at the gas station were able to provide officers with a limited description of the person seen leaving the scene. According to those witness statements, the suspect was described as a young black male. Although several people observed the individual fleeing on foot after the shooting, none of them recognized him or could identify who he was. That basic description became the primary piece of information available to investigators during the early stages of the case. Beyond the eyewitness accounts describing the suspect's appearance, there was little else that could immediately establish the person's identity. Without a name or confirmed identification, the investigation faced significant limitations from the outset. The available information did not provide investigators with a direct path toward identifying the individual responsible for the shooting. As the investigation continued, the lack of additional identifying information meant there was little immediate progress in determining who the suspect was. The case therefore remained unresolved for an extended period. The information available at the time did not allow authorities to move beyond the initial description provided by witnesses. As a result, investigators continued searching for answers, while the identity of the gunman remained unknown. The case stayed open without a known suspect for many years. Based on the information provided, there were no publicly described developments that changed the course of the investigation during that period. Instead, the homicide remained unsolved as investigators continued seeking information that could advance the case. It was not until years later that new information surfaced, providing investigators with a significant lead and marking the beginning of the next phase of the investigation into Wesley Powell's killing. In early 2022, the investigation into Wesley Powell's homicide reached a significant turning point. After years without a resolution, investigators received valuable information regarding the case. According to the available background information, this new information provided the first meaningful advancement in an investigation that had remained unresolved for more than 2 decades. The development marked a clear change in the direction of the case and gave investigators an opportunity to move beyond the limited information that had defined the earlier stages of the investigation. The information investigators received led them to 6-year-old Ricky Witherspoon. Based on the background provided, authorities were able to confirm that Witherspoon was responsible for Wesley Powell's killing. The source material does not describe the nature of the information that led investigators to him, nor does it explain the process through which that conclusion was reached. As a result, those details cannot be expanded upon and remain outside the scope of this account. Even without those additional details, the breakthrough represented the most significant development since the shooting at the Birmingham gas station. For many years, the investigation had continued without a known suspect, leaving the case unresolved. The information received in early 2022 changed that situation by directing investigators toward a specific individual and allowing the case to move forward in a way that had not previously been possible. The confirmation that Ricky Witherspoon was responsible for Wesley Powell's killing marked the first major breakthrough after more than 20 years. It transformed an investigation that had long lacked a known suspect into one with an identified individual connected to the crime. Following this investigative milestone, authorities proceeded with the next formal step in the case, leading to Witherspoon's arrest later in 2022. Following the investigative breakthrough in early 2022, authorities moved forward with the next major step in the case. According to the available information, Ricky Witherspoon was arrested on the 19th of August 2022 in connection with the homicide of Wesley Powell. The arrest came after investigators received information that advanced the long unsolved investigation and ultimately led them to identify Witherspoon as the person responsible for Powell's killing. After being taken into custody, Witherspoon was placed in the Jefferson County Jail. The available background information states that he was being held without bond. Beyond those facts, no additional details are provided regarding court proceedings, evidence presented, or subsequent legal developments. As a result, this account remains limited to the information specifically included in the source material. The arrest represented a significant milestone in an investigation that had remained unresolved for approximately 21 years. For more than 2 decades, authorities had continued searching for the individual responsible for Wesley Powell's death. The identification of Ricky Witherspoon and his arrest marked the point at which the investigation moved from years without a known suspect to the formal custody of the individual investigators had identified in connection with the case. Although the arrest was an important development, the available information focuses only on the factual sequence of events. It confirms the date of the arrest, identifies where Witherspoon was being held, and notes that he remained without bond. No further details about legal proceedings or additional investigative findings are included within the provided background information. Following the arrest, the Birmingham Police Department publicly addressed the case during a news conference. Family members of Wesley Powell attended that announcement and offered brief public remarks, sharing their thoughts after the arrest and reflecting on the long passage of time before the investigation reached this significant point, setting the stage for the family's response and discussion of closure. Following the Birmingham Police Department news conference announcing the arrest, family members of Wesley Powell attended and shared brief public statements. Among them, Wesley Powell Jr. spoke about the long wait for answers and encouraged others not to give up hope. He said there was a time when he really did give up, explaining that after 21 years, he had nearly lost hope before seeing the case move forward. He told those listening that the arrest brought the family a measure of closure. According to his remarks, they could finally begin moving toward moments that had long been overshadowed by uncertainty. He reflected on how the unresolved case affected their family through the years. While other families were having Christmas dinner, he said, his family was burying their son. Those words describe the lasting impact the unresolved homicide had on their lives and the holidays they remembered. The news conference marked a significant moment after more than 2 decades without an arrest. The announcement allowed Wesley Powell Jr. to publicly acknowledge the progress that had finally been made. His message remained focused on perseverance rather than anger. He encouraged others not to give up when waiting for justice, reminding listeners that although he once believed the case might never advance, the investigation ultimately reached an important turning point. The family's remarks concluded the public response to the arrest with gratitude for the progress achieved and hope that other families facing long unanswered cases would continue believing justice could still arrive. His statement did not focus on details beyond the information presented during the conference. Instead, it emphasized patience, persistence, and the importance of never abandoning hope despite years without answers. With the arrest, the family experienced a measure of closure after more than 2 decades, ending this chapter with hope. Susan lived with her husband, Gregory Brent Dennis, and their 2 teenage daughters. She worked as a judge, while Gregory practiced as a doctor. Their household appeared established, and those basic details formed the known background before the events of the 3rd of January 2015 brought their lives into the focus of investigators and emergency responders. On the 3rd of January 2015, Gregory called 911 and reported that Susan was unresponsive. He requested an ambulance to respond to the home. Emergency personnel arrived and transported Susan to the hospital for treatment. Despite those efforts, she did not survive. Her death marked the beginning of an investigation that initially centered on determining what had caused her sudden medical emergency. Medical testing later revealed that Susan had a mixture of antifreeze in her system. That discovery became one of the earliest confirmed findings documented after her death. At the beginning of the investigation, authorities believed it was possible that Susan had taken her own life by ingesting the antifreeze. Based on the information available during those initial stages, investigators considered that possibility while working to understand the circumstances surrounding her death. The known sequence of events remained focused on the emergency call, Susan's transportation to the hospital, and the medical findings that followed. Gregory's report that Susan was unresponsive, the response from emergency services, and the hospital's inability to save her established the timeline for the first phase of the case. The toxicology finding involving antifreeze provided investigators with a specific direction for their early examination of the incident. At that point, the investigation remained centered on the available medical evidence and the circumstances immediately surrounding Susan's death. The initial assessment reflected what investigators knew before examining additional information. The emergency response, the hospital outcome, and the toxicology results formed the foundation of the case as it first unfolded. Those confirmed facts established the starting point from which investigators would continue reviewing the events connected to Susan's death and determine whether the original understanding accurately explained everything that had occurred. As investigators continued reviewing the circumstances surrounding Susan's death, the focus gradually expanded beyond the initial belief that she may have taken her own life. The medical findings remained important, but investigators also began examining information about the people closest to her and the financial circumstances connected to the case. Those efforts introduced additional facts that became part of the broader investigation. During that process, investigators discovered that Gregory had an expensive drug habit. This finding became one of several documented factors they considered while reviewing the available evidence. The information did not, by itself, determine the outcome of the investigation, but it contributed to a broader understanding of Gregory's financial situation at the time Susan died. Investigators also learned that Gregory stood to inherit $2 million in the event of Susan's death. That financial detail became another documented element examined during the case. Because of the significant amount involved, investigators considered it alongside the other information they were collecting. It represented a financial circumstance that became relevant as they continued evaluating whether the original explanation for Susan's death accounted for everything they had uncovered. In addition to financial matters, investigators gathered information regarding the condition of the couple's marriage. According to friends, Gregory and Susan were on the verge of separation when Susan lost her life. Those reported observations became part of the investigative record and provided additional context about the circumstances surrounding the family during that period. The information was treated as another factor uncovered during the investigation, rather than as proof of any specific conclusion. Taken together, the discovery of Gregory's reported drug habit, the potential inheritance of $2 million, and the statements from friends regarding the reported state of the marriage marked an important shift in the investigation. These documented findings encouraged investigators to examine possibilities beyond their initial assumption about Susan's death. Rather than relying solely on the earliest theory, they continued gathering information and evaluating the evidence as new facts emerged. The investigation increasingly reflected a broader review of financial circumstances and personal factors, with each documented finding becoming another piece of information considered during the ongoing effort to understand the events surrounding Susan's death. Those developments redirected investigative attention while remaining grounded in the facts uncovered during the case and the documented information available to authorities at that stage. Investigators continued reconstructing the sequence of events surrounding Susan's final hours by examining Gregory's documented actions before, during, and immediately after the medical emergency. As they reviewed the available evidence, they determined that Gregory contacted emergency responders only after Susan had stopped breathing. That finding became part of the established timeline investigators assembled while examining the circumstances of her death. The timing of the emergency call was documented and considered alongside the other information collected during the investigation. After Susan was transported to the hospital, another documented action became part of the investigative record. Upon arriving at the hospital, Gregory signed a Do Not Resuscitate, or DNR, order. Investigators noted this decision as part of the chronological sequence of events following the emergency response. It was included among the documented facts, reviewed as authorities continued evaluating the circumstances surrounding Susan's death and comparing each event with the developing timeline. Only days after Susan's passing, investigators identified another financial transaction that became relevant to the case. Gregory deposited a $180,000 check from Susan's bank account into his own account. Records showed that the check had been issued on the night before Susan died. Investigators documented both the timing of the check's issuance and the later deposit as part of their examination of financial activity connected to the case. Investigators also considered information provided by one of Gregory's friends. According to that friend, Gregory wanted the money because he believed Susan's parents would freeze the account. The statement became another documented element reviewed during the investigation. Authorities regarded it as significant because it suggested Gregory believed Susan would no longer be alive. Investigators evaluated that statement together with the financial records and the established timeline, while continuing to review the available evidence. Presented in chronological order, these documented events formed an important portion of the investigation. The determination that Gregory contacted emergency responders after Susan had stopped breathing, the signing of the DNR order at the hospital, the deposit of the $180,000 check issued the previous night, and the statement provided by Gregory's friend all became part of the investigative record. Each event was examined as documented information without drawing conclusions beyond the evidence described during the investigation. As the investigation continued, investigators expanded their review of the available evidence by examining Gregory's computer. During that examination, they discovered internet searches concerning how long it takes someone to die after being poisoned with antifreeze. According to the background information, this discovery became the final major piece of evidence referenced during the investigation. Investigators documented the searches and considered them alongside the other information that had already been collected throughout the case. The computer findings were added to the investigative record as authorities continued reviewing the circumstances surrounding Susan's death. The internet search history became part of a larger collection of documented findings that investigators had assembled over time. Earlier information regarding the emergency response, medical testing, financial matters, and Gregory's documented actions had already shifted the direction of the investigation. The computer evidence represented another development that investigators evaluated while continuing to organize the available facts in chronological order. Rather than standing alone, the searches became one additional element within the broader investigative process described in the available information. As investigators continued reviewing the case, the inquiry progressed over the following years. The background information states that the investigation ultimately led to Gregory's arrest in connection with Susan's death during 2017. That arrest marked a significant procedural development after investigators completed their review of the evidence referenced throughout the case. The arrest itself represented the next major milestone in the documented timeline following the investigative findings. Shortly after being arrested, Gregory posted a $250,000 bail. After posting bail, he was released while the legal process continued. The background information identifies this release as part of the procedural history of the case. Following the arrest, these events reflected the documented progression from investigation to arrest and then to release on bail, without providing additional details regarding legal arguments or courtroom proceedings. The available information focuses on the investigative findings that preceded these developments, rather than describing additional evidence beyond what was already documented. The examination of Gregory's computer and the discovery of searches concerning antifreeze poisoning remain the final major evidentiary point referenced in the background material. Investigators considered those searches together with the previously documented facts as they continued their review of the case. From the examination of digital evidence through Gregory's arrest in 2017 and his subsequent release after posting a $250,000 bail, the documented timeline reflects the procedural developments included in the background information. The investigation advanced through each stage based on the findings that investigators had assembled over time. The available material does not describe additional investigative techniques, further digital discoveries, or courtroom proceedings beyond these events. Instead, it concludes this portion of the case with the documented computer searches, the arrest connected to Susan's death, and Gregory's release on bail after satisfying the required amount. These procedural developments mark the closing stages of the investigative timeline presented in the available background information before the case later moved toward its legal resolution. Throughout this period, investigators remained focused on reviewing the documented evidence they had gathered, and the computer search history became the final investigative finding, specifically identified before the case advanced from investigation into the next phase of formal criminal proceedings. In 2022, the case reached the legal outcome described in the available background information. Gregory and his legal team pleaded guilty and agreed to a sentence of 3 to 10 years in prison. That agreement marked the concluding procedural development presented in the documented timeline and represented the final legal step identified within the information provided about Susan's death and the investigation that followed. The case had begun on January 3, 2015. When Gregory called 911 to report that Susan was unresponsive. She was transported to the hospital but did not survive. Medical testing later found a mixture of antifreeze in her system, and investigators initially believed she might have taken her own life by ingesting the substance. As the investigation continued, authorities reviewed additional information that gradually expanded the scope of the case beyond that original assumption. During the investigation, authorities documented Gregory's expensive drug habit and learned that he stood to inherit $2 million in the event of Susan's death. According to friends, Gregory and Susan were on the verge of separation when she died. Investigators also determined that Gregory contacted emergency responders only after Susan had stopped breathing, and that he signed a do not resuscitate order after arriving at the hospital. Days later, he deposited a $180,000 check from Susan's bank account into his own account after the check had been issued on the night before her death. Investigators additionally reviewed information provided by one of Gregory's friends regarding the purpose of that deposit and included the statement as part of the investigative record. Authorities later examined Gregory's computer and found internet searches asking how long it takes someone to die after being poisoned with antifreeze. According to the background information, that discovery became the final major piece of evidence referenced during the investigation. The case continued until 2017, when Gregory was arrested in connection with Susan's death. Shortly after his arrest, he posted a $250,000 bail and was released while the legal process continued. The documented sequence of events concluded in 2022, with Gregory's guilty plea and the agreed sentence of 3 to 10 years in prison, according to the background information. He was scheduled to be sentenced on May 10 inches, the Clark County District Court. That scheduled sentencing concludes the documented timeline provided, ending the case summary with the legal agreement and the final court proceeding identified in the available information without additional developments or commentary beyond the supplied background material and its stated procedural outcome. On the 29th of October, 2007, hunters discovered the body of a man in a desert area near Stanfield, Arizona. The finding immediately prompted a law enforcement response as investigators arrived to examine the scene and begin documenting the circumstances surrounding the discovery. At that stage, the priority was to determine the identity of the victim and establish the basic facts needed to open the investigation. As investigators continued their work, the victim was identified as 7-year-old Arturo Martinez-Altamirano. Confirming his identity marked the first significant step in the case, allowing authorities to focus their efforts on understanding what had happened and determining who might be responsible. The available information established who the victim was, but it did not explain why the crime had occurred or what events had led to his death. With Arturo Martinez-Altamirano identified, law enforcement formally began investigating the case. Detectives collected the available information and started following the facts as they emerged. At this stage, the investigation centered on documenting the known details surrounding the discovery and identifying the individuals connected to the case. The information available publicly from this point remained limited, and investigators continued working within the facts they had established. The discovery in the Arizona desert became the starting point of a case that would continue beyond the initial investigation. Authorities had identified the victim and launched their inquiry, but many questions remained unanswered. The investigation would soon shift from establishing the victim's identity to determining responsibility for Arturo Martinez-Altamirano's death. That transition marked the next phase of the case, as detectives continued pursuing the facts available to them through their investigation. Following the identification of Arturo Martinez-Altamirano, investigators continued examining the available information surrounding the case. Their efforts progressed quickly, and witness information soon allowed detectives to determine who they believed was responsible for Arturo's death. Based on that information, investigators identified Oscar Tejeda Mejia as the person they were seeking in connection with the case. The identification of a suspect represented an important development in the investigation. Detectives no longer faced the uncertainty of not knowing who they believed was responsible. Instead, their attention shifted toward locating Oscar Tejeda Mejia so that the investigation could move forward through the legal process. At this stage, investigators had established the identity of the individual they believed was responsible, marking a significant step beyond the initial discovery of the victim. However, identifying a suspect did not immediately lead to an arrest. Although investigators knew who they were looking for, Oscar Tejeda Mejia could not be located. His absence created a major obstacle for the investigation because authorities were unable to place him into custody. The case had advanced through the identification of a suspect, yet an essential part of the investigative process remained incomplete. The distinction between identifying a suspect and apprehending one became increasingly clear. Detectives had reached an important conclusion based on the witness information available to them, but they still could not bring Oscar before the justice system. Without locating him, the investigation could not proceed as authorities intended. As time continued to pass, the inability to find Oscar Tejeda Mejia prevented investigators from completing the next phase of the case, despite having identified the person they believed was responsible for Arturo Martinez-Altamirano's death. Although investigators had identified Oscar Tejeda Mejia as the person they believed was responsible for Arturo Martinez-Altamirano's death, the investigation reached a difficult point when they could not locate him. Knowing the identity of a suspect was an important step, but without finding him, authorities were unable to move the case toward an arrest or the next stage of the legal process. As time passed, the situation remained unchanged. Investigators continued facing the same obstacle that had emerged after identifying the suspect. Oscar Tejeda Mejia remained unavailable, preventing authorities from bringing him into custody. The passage of months and then years underscored the challenge confronting the investigation. Despite knowing who they were seeking, detectives could not proceed without locating him. Eventually, the case went cold. The investigation had stalled because authorities were unable to find the suspect they had identified. With no arrest possible, progress slowed, and the case remained unresolved. The delay reflected the practical reality that identifying a suspect alone was not enough to complete an investigation when that individual could not be found. Throughout those years, the central issue remained unchanged. Investigators believed they knew who was responsible, yet they were unable to locate Oscar Tejeda Mejia. As a result, the case stayed inactive for an extended period, waiting for circumstances that would allow it to move forward again. The focus during this period was not on new developments, but on the continuing absence of the suspect. Until authorities could locate him, the investigation remained at a standstill, leaving the case unresolved despite the earlier identification of the person investigators believed was responsible for Arturo Martinez-Altamirano's death. Years after the investigation had stalled, new information brought renewed progress to the case. In 2017, investigators learned that Oscar Tejeda Mejia was living in Mexico. This discovery marked a significant development because it established where the previously missing suspect was believed to be located. After years without meaningful movement, the investigation regained direction through this updated information. Learning Oscar Tejeda Mejia's location did not immediately conclude the case, but it provided investigators with an opportunity to continue pursuing the matter. The investigation, which had remained inactive because the suspect could not be found, now entered a new phase. Authorities once again had developments to follow, allowing the case to move forward after an extended period without resolution. The following year, in 2018, investigators obtained a DNA sample with the assistance of a person close to Oscar Tejeda Mejia. According to the available background information, that DNA sample confirmed that Oscar was responsible for what happened to Arturo Martinez-Altamirano. The information strengthened the investigation and provided confirmation that supported what investigators had previously concluded regarding the case. These developments unfolded in chronological order, beginning with the discovery that Oscar Tejeda Mejia was living in Mexico and followed by the DNA confirmation obtained in 2018. Together, they transformed an investigation that had remained inactive for years into one that was moving forward once again. Although the case was still not complete, investigators had regained important momentum through these confirmed developments. The renewed progress demonstrated that, despite the passage of time, the investigation continued advancing based on new information and evidence that reinforced the case concerning the death of Arturo Martinez-Altamirano and the identified suspect, Oscar Tejeda Mejia. Following the DNA confirmation in 2018, the investigation had gained important support, but the case was still not complete. Although investigators had confirmed Oscar Tejeda Mejia's responsibility according to the available information, additional time passed before he could be returned to the United States. The progress achieved through the renewed investigation did not immediately result in his arrest, and authorities continued waiting for the next stage of the case. Several more years passed after the DNA confirmation before investigators were finally able to bring Oscar Tejeda Mejia back to Arizona. During this period, the investigation remained active, but the process of returning the suspect required additional time. The available information does not describe the legal steps involved, only that investigators continued working until the suspect could be returned to the United States. As a result, the case continued moving forward, although the final outcome had not yet been reached. On the 12th of January 2022, that process reached a significant milestone. 59-year-old Oscar Tejeda Mejia was extradited to Arizona and booked into jail. After years had passed since Arturo Martinez-Altamirano's death, and after investigators had spent considerable time pursuing the case, authorities were finally able to take the identified suspect into custody in the United States. The extradition marked the final step that allowed investigators to formally arrest Oscar Tejeda Mejia after many years. What began with the discovery of Arturo Martinez-Altamirano in 2007 had progressed through identification of a suspect, years without resolution, renewed investigative developments, and ultimately the successful return of the suspect to Arizona. With Oscar Tejeda Mejia booked into jail, investigators had finally reached the stage they had worked toward throughout the lengthy investigation. Following the successful extradition and arrest of Oscar Tejeda Mejia, Sheriff Mark Lamb publicly recognized the efforts of the investigators who had worked on the case over many years. His statement reflected the official response to the conclusion of a lengthy investigation that had continued despite significant challenges and the passage of time. The extradition represented the point at which authorities were finally able to bring the identified suspect into custody in Arizona. Sheriff Mark Lamb stated, "I am impressed by my detectives and their commitment to bring this suspect to justice. When political boundaries threatened to derail their progress, our guys and gals got creative." His remarks acknowledged the persistence of the detectives and highlighted the determination they demonstrated while pursuing the case. The statement also emphasized that investigators continued working toward the same objective, even when political boundaries presented obstacles during the investigation. The sheriff's comments served as recognition of the investigative team's commitment following the successful return of Oscar Tejeda Mejia to the United States. After years had passed since Arturo Martinez-Altamirano's death, the investigation ultimately reached the stage where the identified suspect was extradited to Arizona and booked into jail. The official statement underscored the importance of that achievement without expanding beyond the facts that were publicly provided. Although investigators ultimately located Oscar Tejeda Mejia, confirmed his responsibility according to the available information, and secured his extradition after many years, one important question remains unanswered. According to the available background information, it is still not known why Oscar Tejeda Mejia took the life of Arturo Martinez-Altamirano. No motive has been disclosed, and the reason behind the crime remains unknown based on the information currently available about this case. Helen Margaret Brooks was 63 years old and lived in Apple Valley, California in 1985. She was known as a well-liked woman within her community and worked as a model for Lolo's fashion boutique at the Apple Valley Inn. These are the confirmed details available about her life before the events that led to the investigation. They provide the documented background investigators had when examining the circumstances surrounding her death. On the 5th of July 1985, Helen's friends and coworkers became concerned after they had not heard from her for several days. Their growing concern led them to visit her home at the Apple Valley Gardens Apartments to check on her welfare. When they entered the apartment, they found Helen's body inside. Investigators determined that she had been strangled, turning the welfare check into the beginning of a homicide investigation. Law enforcement officers immediately processed the crime scene and carefully collected evidence that could assist the investigation. Among the items gathered was DNA evidence that investigators believed might eventually help identify the person responsible. However, forensic DNA technology in 1985 was still limited compared with later scientific advancements. Although physical evidence existed from the beginning of the investigation, the available testing methods could not provide the level of analysis that modern investigators would later achieve. As detectives continued documenting the scene and preserving the evidence, they recognized the importance of maintaining everything recovered for future examination. Even though investigators had collected potentially valuable forensic material, the scientific capabilities of the time prevented them from fully identifying the person responsible through DNA analysis. The case therefore began with important physical evidence already in hand, but the technological limitations of the era prevented detectives from reaching the answers they were seeking at that time. Detectives continued their investigation after processing the crime scene and reviewing the evidence collected from Helen Margaret Brooks's apartment. During their investigation, they learned that 7-year-old Robert Eugene Wortman had met Helen in the days before her death. According to investigators, Wortman had been inside her apartment sometime between July 3 and July 5. Because of this information, investigators interviewed Wortman about his connection to Helen. During questioning, he said that he had no knowledge of what had happened to Helen and denied that he had entered her apartment. Those statements were documented as part of the investigation, and detectives continued evaluating the available evidence alongside his account of events. Despite investigators' interest in Wortman, they were unable to prove that he was responsible for Helen's death. The evidence available at the time did not definitively connect him to the crime, so no charges were brought against him during the original investigation. Without sufficient proof, detectives could not move forward with the prosecution, even though they had identified a person of interest early in the case. As the investigation continued, detectives pursued additional leads, but none provided the evidence needed to resolve the homicide. The case gradually stalled because investigators lacked enough evidence to establish responsibility through the investigative methods available at the time. Although detectives remained engaged with the case, the limitations of the original investigation prevented them from fully resolving it, allowing the homicide to remain unsolved, despite identifying a person of interest early in the investigation. Even so, investigators preserved the information they had gathered and maintained the case records for future review. At that stage, however, the available evidence remained insufficient to identify the responsible person through legally supportable proof, leaving the investigation without the breakthrough detectives needed to advance beyond its original findings at that. Helen Brooks' homicide became a cold case as investigators continued searching for answers over many years. Throughout that time, detectives conducted additional interviews and administered polygraph examinations in an effort to identify the person responsible for Helen's death. Despite those investigative efforts, none produced sufficient evidence to solve the homicide. As the years passed, the investigation became increasingly difficult. Memories faded. Time moved forward, and the challenges facing investigators continued to grow. Even so, detectives never completely abandoned the case. They continued reviewing information, pursuing available leads, and revisiting the investigation, but no breakthrough occurred during those years. In 2009, cold case detectives reopened the investigation and re-examined evidence collected decades earlier. Preserved items were submitted for newer DNA testing techniques, allowing investigators to develop a suspect DNA profile. Although this represented significant progress compared with the original investigation, the resulting DNA profile did not match anyone already contained in law enforcement DNA databases. Without a matching profile, investigators still could not identify the suspect. Modern forensic science had advanced substantially since 1985, and the renewed examination demonstrated how preserved evidence could reveal information unavailable during the original investigation. Nevertheless, despite developing a suspect DNA profile through improved testing methods, detectives still lacked the final piece needed to determine the suspect's identity. The case therefore remained unresolved, illustrating both the value of preserving evidence and the continuing challenge of solving a homicide when available forensic results could not yet identify the responsible individual. Even with measurable scientific progress, investigators could only narrow the search rather than complete it. The preserved evidence remains central to future efforts, and detectives recognize that additional advances in forensic technology might eventually provide the answer that years of interviews, examinations, and database comparisons had not yet delivered. Until then, the investigation remained open for resolution. Advances in forensic science ultimately transformed the investigation. In 2021, investigators partnered with the FBI to utilize more advanced DNA technology than had previously been available. Working together, investigators further analyzed the biological evidence collected from Helen's apartment decades earlier. This collaboration allowed them to apply improved forensic methods to evidence that had already been preserved throughout the investigation. Those scientific advances produced the confirmation investigators had sought for many years. In 2022, investigators confirmed that Robert Eugene Wortman was responsible for what happened to Helen. This conclusion reflected the official investigative finding described in the case after decades of continued review. It was based on the improved analysis of preserved biological evidence rather than the investigative limitations that existed during the original inquiry. The identification represented the culmination of decades of investigative work, preserved evidence, repeated reviews of the case, and continually improving forensic technology. Although investigators had considered Wortman early in the investigation, they had been unable to prove his involvement until DNA science advanced enough to establish that connection many years later. The preserved evidence collected in 1985 ultimately became the key to solving the case decades after the crime occurred. Its careful preservation allowed investigators to benefit from scientific progress that did not exist when the homicide was first investigated. The evidence remained available for renewed testing, and those later examinations provided the confirmation that earlier investigators could not obtain. This outcome demonstrated how preserved forensic evidence, combined with advancing DNA technology and persistent investigative review, eventually resolved questions that had remained unanswered for decades, connecting the original evidence directly to the official identification of the responsible individual through modern scientific analysis. After investigators confirmed that Robert Eugene Wortman was responsible for what happened to Helen Margaret Brooks, they also reviewed his criminal history following her homicide. Investigators found that Wortman had an extensive history of violent criminal behavior during the years after Helen's death, adding further context to their understanding of the case after the DNA identification. In August 1985, Wortman was arrested on suspicion of attempting to assault a woman at the Cocky Bowl restaurant and bar on Highway 395 Victorville. Years later, in 1991, a jury convicted him of assaulting a different woman at a bar in Apple Valley. These incidents became part of the documented criminal history investigators considered after confirming his responsibility in Helen's case. Wortman later died in prison in 1995 while serving a 2-year sentence. Because he died many years before advances in DNA technology identified him in connection with Helen Brooks's homicide, he could never be prosecuted for that crime. Although investigators ultimately determined responsibility through modern forensic science, his death meant the case could not proceed through the criminal court process. Investigators now believe Wortman may have been involved in additional crimes, and those possibilities are currently under investigation. While those investigations continue, the resolution of Helen Margaret Brooks' case rests on the preserved evidence collected in 1985 and the advances in DNA technology that finally allowed investigators to determine responsibility decades later. Although the identified suspect could not stand trial because he had already died, the investigation reached an official conclusion through scientific analysis of preserved evidence, bringing long-awaited resolution to Helen's case, based solely on the forensic findings developed over many years of continued investigative work and technological progress.